On the night of the 28th of May, 1453, an emperor stood on a broken wall and watched the largest army in the world prepare to end 1,000 years of history. Behind him lay Constantinople, the last living fragment of the Roman Empire, defended by barely 7,000 exhausted men. Before him waited a host of perhaps 80,000, and a young sultan who had sworn to take the city or die trying. The emperor, Constantine, was offered gold, safe passage, and a kingdom of his own if only he would leave, and he refused every time. When the final assault broke through, he threw off the purple robes of an emperor, drew his sword, and charged into the enemy as a common soldier, never to be seen again. This is the story of the losing side. To understand what died that morning, you have to go back more than 1,000 years to the founding of a second Rome. In the year 330, the Emperor Constantine the Great moved the capital of the Roman world to a small Greek town on the edge of Europe and Asia. He renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and it became the beating heart of the Roman Empire for the next 11 centuries. While the western half of Rome collapsed into ruin, the eastern half endured, and men still called themselves Romans in its streets. Constantinople grew into the richest and greatest city in the Christian world, a wonder that pilgrims crossed continents to see. At its heart rose Hagia Sophia, a church so vast and golden that visitors said they no longer knew whether they stood on earth or in heaven. And around the whole city ran the Theodosian Walls, the mightiest fortifications ever built in the ancient world. A moat, then a low outer wall, then a great inner wall studded with 96 towers, 3 lines of defense, one behind the other. For 1,000 years, those walls turned back every army that dared to come, Persians and Avars, Arabs and Bulgars, Rus and Turks alike. As long as the wall stood, the Roman Empire lived, and men called the city simply the God-guarded city. But an empire is more than its walls, and behind them Rome had been dying for a very long time. For centuries, the empire had been bleeding away its lands, province by province, war by war. From the east, new enemies rose out of the steppe and the desert and tore away Syria, Egypt, and half of Anatolia. But the deepest wound of all was struck not by a foreign foe, but by fellow Christians. In the year 1204, a crusade meant for Jerusalem was turned instead against Constantinople itself. The crusaders stormed the great city, sacked it for 3 days, and carried its treasures back to the west. For the first time in 900 years, the impregnable city had fallen, and the Roman Empire never truly recovered. Though the Romans won their capital back decades later, they returned to a broken, plundered shell of a city. The empire that remained was a ghost of its former self, poor, shrunken, and surrounded on every side. Meanwhile, across the water in Anatolia, a new and hungry power was rising with astonishing speed. The Ottoman Turks swept over the old Roman lands, one town at a time, until the empire was little more than the city itself. By the middle of the 15th century, the Roman Empire had shrunk to Constantinople, and a few scraps of land it could no longer defend. Into this dying world, in the year 1451, came a new sultan, only 21 years old, named Mehmed II. Where others saw an old and harmless city, the young sultan saw the one prize that would make him immortal. Mehmed became consumed by a single burning ambition, to be the man who finally took Constantinople. First he choked the city's lifeline, building a great fortress on the Bosphorus to cut off all help from the sea. Then he turned to the walls that had defied the world for 1,000 years, and he found a way to break them. A cannon maker named Orban offered the Sultan a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. He cast a monstrous bronze bombard, so huge it took 60 oxen to drag it, and it could hurl a stone the weight of a man. For the first time in history, the ancient walls of Constantinople could be smashed to rubble from a distance. Mehmed gathered a vast army, perhaps 80,000 fighting men, and marched them to the city in the spring of 1453. Inside the walls, the last emperor, Constantine XI, counted his defenders and found fewer than 7,000. He begged the kings of Europe for help, and out of all of Christendom, only a handful of Italian ships and soldiers came. If the last stand of a doomed man moves you, take 1 second to subscribe now. Back to the walls. On the 6th of April 1453, the great guns of Mehmed opened fire, and the siege of Constantinople began. Day after day the giant cannon thundered, and slowly, section by section, the ancient walls began to crumble. But each night, under cover of darkness, the exhausted defenders rushed out to fill the breaches with earth, timber, and barrel. For every stretch of wall the cannon knocked down by day, the Romans raised a new rampart by night. The heart of the sea defense was a giant iron chain, stretched across the mouth of the harbour to keep the Ottoman fleet out. Again and again, the Turkish ships tried to force the chain, and again they were driven back in flame. So Mehmed did something no one had believed possible. He moved his warships over dry land. In a single night, greased wooden planks carried 70 ships over a hill and down into the harbour behind the chain. The defenders woke to find an enemy fleet inside their own harbour, and a whole new stretch of wall to guard with men they did not have. Still the city held week after week, as its defenders were stretched thinner and thinner along the miles of wall. The people of Constantinople carried stones to the ramparts and prayed in Hagia Sophia for a miracle that never came. Food ran short, sleep ran shorter, and every man on the walls knew that no great army was coming to save them. Mehmed launched assault after assault, hurling his men against the broken walls, and each time the defenders threw them back. The ground before the walls filled with the dead, but the Sultan had men to spare, and the Romans did not. 50 days passed, and the tiny garrison had held the greatest army in the world at bay against every hope. But the walls were failing, the men were spent, and the Sultan was preparing one final, overwhelming blow. On the 28th of May, an eerie quiet fell over the Ottoman camp as Mehmed rested his army for the assault to come. Inside the city, Constantine gathered his commanders one last time in the great church of Hagia Sophia. Greeks and Italians, Orthodox and Catholic, men who had quarreled for centuries, prayed together that night as brothers. The emperor rode along the walls one final time, thanking his soldiers and asking their forgiveness for any wrong he had done them. He told them that a man should be ready to die for his faith, his family, his country, and his emperor. Now, he said, all 4 of those things were bound up in the walls they were about to defend. Then Constantine took his place at the most broken and dangerous stretch of the wall and waited for the dawn. In the darkness before sunrise on the 29th of May, the great Ottoman assault began. First Mehmed sent in his weakest troops, wave after wave, to wear down the defenders and blunt their swords. For 2 hours the Romans held, killing attacker after attacker, refusing to break. Then came the second wave, and at last the Sultan unleashed his elite, the Janissaries, the finest soldiers in the world. By now the defenders had fought without rest for hours, and their numbers were bleeding away with every attack. In the chaos, a small gate called the Kakuporta was left carelessly unlocked, and a band of Turks slipped inside. They climbed a tower, tore down the emperor's banner, and raised the Ottoman flag high above the walls. At almost the same moment, the great Italian commander Giustiniani was struck down by a wound and carried from the field. Seeing their bravest captain gone and enemy flags above them, the defenders' courage finally began to break. The cry went up that the city was taken, and the thin line on the walls dissolved into panic and flight. The Janissaries poured through the breaches in an unstoppable flood, and the defense collapsed all along the wall. In that final, hopeless moment, the last Roman emperor faced a choice that would echo through the ages. He could have run for a waiting ship, as many did, and lived out his days in exile as an emperor, without an empire. Instead, Constantine tore the purple robes and imperial eagles from his shoulders, so that no one could tell him from any other man. With his sword in his hand, the last emperor of Rome charged into the oncoming enemy at the head of his few remaining men. He was swallowed by the crush of battle, and from that instant he was never seen alive again. No one could ever say for certain how he died, and his body was never found among the fallen. The line of Roman emperors that stretched back 1,500 years simply vanished into the fall of his city. By the morning of the 29th of May, 1453, Ottoman flags flew over Constantinople, and the Roman Empire was no more. Mehmed, now the conqueror of the ages, rode slowly through the fallen streets to the great church of Hagia Sophia. That afternoon, in the golden church where Roman emperors had been crowned for centuries, a new call to prayer was heard for the first time. Constantinople, the god-guarded city, would soon become Istanbul, the capital of a new and mighty empire. For the Ottomans it was a glorious beginning, but for the Romans it was the end of a world that had lasted 1,000 years. Scholars fleeing the dying city carried the wisdom of the ancient Greeks west into Italy, helping to spark the Renaissance. And the Greeks never forgot their lost emperor, telling a legend that he had not died, but was turned to marble and hidden away. One day, they whispered, the marble emperor would wake, take back the city, and the empire of the Romans would rise again. This has been the story of the losing side.